Think about your own morning routine today. You woke up, maybe you flipped a switch, and the lights instantly flooded the room.
Right.
You open the refrigerator, pulling out, out-of-season fruit that was flown across an ocean just hours ago. You tapped a piece of glass in your pocket, and an invisible network of underwater cables and orbiting satellites instantly verified your identity and updated your bank balance.
It's incredible when you really stop to think about it.
It is. It all just seamlessly works. We exist inside this incredibly intricate, invisible web of systems that makes our modern lives not just comfortable, but literally biologically possible.
Yeah.
But what happens if that web is suddenly violently severed?
That is the big question.
Yeah. So today we are taking a deep dive into a really fascinating stack of recent scientific papers, climate models, geopolitical risk forecasts, and structural engineering studies. And our mission here is to map out the absolute fragility of this hyperconnected world we've built.
And it is fragile.
Extremely. We're going to unpack a concept that risk analysts call civilizational capital. And we are exploring the precise mechanics of what actually happens to the global food supply, the electric grid, and our digital infrastructure when faced with extreme cascading shocks.
Shocks like regional nuclear conflicts or multi-decade power grid failures.
Exactly. Or electromagnetic pulse weapons. Now, I want to reassure you right out of the gate, while the data we are looking at is undeniably heavy, the goal today is not to ruin your week or send you doom scrolling.
Definitely not.
It's about achieving a profound aha moment. It's about pulling back the curtain on how our global systems actually function under the hood, how deeply reliant they are on one another, and crucially, how the brightest engineers and scientists propose we might actually architect them to survive.
It's a vital conversation to have right now and to really set the stage for the deeply interconnected systems we're going to explore today. We have to frame our thinking around a concept that permeates all the literature we're examining.
Right, the ledger.
Yes, it's referred to as the terminal ledger or kinetic debt. When we look at modern human civilization, we really have to understand that it operates as a breathtakingly efficient but dangerously brittle just-in-time machine.
Just in time, meaning no real backups.
Exactly. Over the last 50 years, we have optimized everything, from our microchip supply chains to our global agricultural deliveries. We optimized it all for maximum efficiency and profit. But in doing so, we have systematically eliminated our buffers. We essentially have zero tolerance for systemic shock.
We spent the safety net.
We did. So when an extreme event occurs, it isn't just a localized tragedy. It acts as a massive immediate withdrawal against our civilizational capital. It creates a kinetic debt that ripples outward, destabilizing every single interdependent network we rely on to function.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with what the models suggest might be the ultimate shock to that highly optimized system.
The nuclear scenarios.
Yeah. Because when you or I think of nuclear war, our minds immediately go to the horrific kinetic impact, the blast, the thermal radiation, the immediate leveling of a city center.
That was devastating, obviously.
Right, but the atmospheric and agricultural models we're looking at today, specifically a massive multi-institution analysis led by Rutgers University and published in Nature Food, they flip that perspective completely. They focus not on the blast radius, but on the brutal, inescapable mathematics of what comes in the months and years after.
The fallout, but in a systemic sense.
Yes. And to do this, they model a regional nuclear war. The scenario they run the numbers on is a hypothetical contained conflict between India and Pakistan. And the most terrifying takeaway from their data is that the whole concept of a limited or regional nuclear war is a complete geopolitical myth.
It is an absolute myth. And the atmospheric physics are unequivocal on this point. The Rutgers model runs a scenario where two regional powers utilize less than 3% of the global nuclear arsenal.
3%. That's tiny in the grand scheme.
Very small. We're talking about an exchange of roughly 100 to 250 weapons with explosive yields ranging from 15 to 100 kilotons. Now, in the historical context of the massive multi-megaton weapons of the Cold War, that might sound relatively small.
Right.
But what the climate models clearly demonstrate is that if these lower-yield weapons are detonated over dense, modern cities and industrial zones, the resulting firestorms would be ecologically catastrophic on a planetary scale.
Because of the soot?
Precisely. The intense heat of these firestorms acts almost like a giant chimney. It creates pyrocumulonimbus clouds that pump massive amounts of soot, specifically between 5 and 47 teragrams, which translates to millions of tons of dense black carbon straight up into the stratosphere.
And the stratosphere is the critical factor there, isn't it? Because once that soot breaches the troposphere and enters the upper atmosphere, it sits above the weather.
Yeah, it doesn't rain out.
It just gets caught in the high-altitude winds and spreads globally.
Within weeks, this massive injection of black carbon disperses around the entire globe, essentially forming a shield that absorbs and reflects incoming solar radiation.
It blocks the sun.
It blocks the sun. To give you a historical baseline from the climatology models, think back to the 1815 Tambora volcanic eruption in Indonesia.
The year without a summer.
Exactly. That geological event caused widespread crop failures, snow in June in the Northern Hemisphere, and regional famines. But the atmospheric cooling generated by even a limited regional nuclear exchange would be exponentially more severe.
And longer lasting.
Much longer. It wouldn't last for a single summer. It would last for the better part of a decade. In the worst-case regional scenarios they modeled, we are looking at abrupt planetary temperature drops that mirror the climate of the last ice age.
Which the paleoclimatology data notes was about 5 degrees Celsius cooler globally than our current baseline.
5 degrees is massive.
It is a staggering climatic shift occurring not over millennia, but over weeks. I mean, our ancestors were dealing with glaciers and woolly mammoths the last time the Earth was consistently that cold.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the absolute core of the Rutgers study, the caloric collapse. Because when the sun is physically blocked and the temperatures plummet by 5 degrees globally, modern global agriculture doesn't just struggle, it essentially crashes.
It stops functioning.
The statistics highlighted in the agricultural modeling are just sobering. They looked at the frost-free growing seasons for the world's major caloric engines: maize, wheat, rice, and soy.
The staples.
The staples. In the 47 teragram soot scenario, again, just a regional conflict, total global calories produced from these staple crops would plummet by 23 to 48%.
Yeah, nearly half.
And if you scale up their model to a systemic conflict between the U.S. and Russia, which would inject roughly 150 teragrams of soot, global crop calories decrease by around 90% within 3 to 4 years of the exchange.
The broader implications of those percentages are incredibly difficult for the human mind to fully conceptualize until we distill them down to the daily reality of human metabolism.
Right, the actual daily calories.
Yes. The Food and Agriculture Organization tracks this data meticulously. They note that the current global average intake is around 2,884 kilocalories per person per day.
Around 2,800.
Right, so when you model a sudden global drop of 40% or 90% in total available food, you aren't talking about populations having to tighten their belts or shift their diets or skip dessert.
Right.
You are pushing billions of people well below the 1,600 kilocalorie threshold.
And that 1,600 calorie marker is a hypercritical threshold in the physiological data because that represents the basal metabolic rate for the average adult.
It's the floor.
It is the absolute minimum amount of energy your internal organs need just to sustain basic resting life functions. Literally just to keep your heart beating and your brain functioning while lying perfectly still.
Yeah.
When the global food supply drops by half, we aren't talking about widespread malnutrition. The models are describing literal, unavoidable starvation on a multi-continental scale. The brutal math of the terminal ledger becomes ruthlessly clear.
It does.
And, when you read these deeply apocalyptic scenarios, the natural, deeply ingrained human reaction is to immediately look for the loophole.
Of course. We want a way out.
Right. We read these numbers and think, well, humanity's endlessly adaptable. If grain yields drop, we'll just adapt our systems. We'll stop feeding massive amounts of corn and soy to cows and pigs. We'll slaughter the livestock, eat the meat, and then shift all that animal feed directly to human consumption.
That's the most common counterargument.
Or we think we'll just turn to the oceans and fish our way out of the famine. But the brilliant part of this nature food study is that the scientists specifically modeled those exact mitigation strategies to see if they hold up.
And they ran the numbers on it.
They did. They ran a no livestock response scenario where 100% of animal feed is forcefully shifted to human consumption. And they ran data on heavily relying on wild-catch marine fisheries. But the data shows exactly why these seemingly logical adaptations utterly fail to save the global population.
They fail because the kinetic shock to the biosphere is utterly comprehensive.
Right.
Let's look at the oceans first, because there's a common misconception that the oceans would act as a thermal and biological refuge during a nuclear winter. Because water has a massive heat capacity, it's true that the ocean temperatures don't decline as sharply or as rapidly as terrestrial temperatures.
So the water stays relatively warm.
Relatively, yes. However, the critical factor isn't just temperature, it's sunlight. The massive reduction in solar radiation penetrating the water column severely impacts the ocean's net primary productivity.
The phytoplankton.
Exactly, the phytoplankton. That is the foundational base of the entire marine food web. When the phytoplankton dies off from lack of sunlight, the growth and reproduction of all fish biomass above it drops significantly.
The whole chain collapses.
It does. Furthermore, the data points out a crucial scaling issue. Wild-caught marine fish currently account for only about 0.5% of total global calories consumed.
Only 0.5%.
That's it. So even if we miraculously mobilized massive, fuel-intensive fleets to intensify fishing efforts in a freezing world, we would rapidly overharvest and collapse a dying ecosystem. It is a biological and mathematical impossibility for the oceans to offset a 40 or 90% loss of terrestrial agriculture.
Wow. And when you look at shifting the livestock feed, I mean, currently, a massive percentage of global agriculture is dedicated just to feeding animals. Surely repurposing that buys us time.
It offers a very slight temporary buffer, but structurally, it's fundamentally insufficient. The core issue is that the climate perturbation, the freezing temperatures, and the shortened growing seasons is so severe that the growth of the feed crops and the pastures themselves are deeply impaired.
Because it's too cold to even grow the cow feed.
Right. You cannot repurpose livestock feed for humans if the feed itself simply will not grow in the new, colder climate.
That makes a terrifying kind of sense.
And furthermore, the socioeconomic models assume a complete, instantaneous halt to all international food trade. When a global agricultural shock of this magnitude hits, panicked nations immediately close their borders. They hoard whatever caloric output they can still produce domestically.
Every nation for itself.
Exactly. So countries that rely heavily on food imports suffer immediate, devastating caloric deficits, regardless of how much livestock feed they try to repurpose. When you run all these variables together, the atmospheric cooling, the marine ecosystem collapse, the halted trade, the bottom line is just devastating.
The mortality numbers they project in the report are staggering. They estimate that roughly 2 billion people could die from starvation in the years following an India-Pakistan regional war. 2 billion.
From a regional conflict.
Yes. And in a broader U.S.-Russia conflict scenario, the models project 5 billion people dead within 2 years.
Yeah.
That is more than half the human population wiped out, not by the bombs, but by the collapse of the caloric engine.
What's fascinating here is how clearly these datasets demonstrate that the indirect effects of these weapon systems, the starvation, the freezing, the cascading collapse of the global food web, will vastly, exponentially dwarf the direct kinetic fatalities of the blasts themselves.
The blasts are just the catalyst.
Exactly. The initial thermal flash, the blast wave, and the localized radiation might kill tens of millions in the immediate vicinity of the targets. But the subsequent disruption of the Earth's climate engine will kill billions halfway across the globe in countries that had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict. It completely redefines our fundamental understanding of what these weapons actually do. They aren't just city destroyers or military tools. They are foundational ecosystem destroyers.
Which flows perfectly into how we understand the fragility of the systems we built on top of that ecosystem. Because grasping that level of systemic collapse is key to really understanding this concept of the nuclear ledger that our sources discuss.
The civilizational capital.
Right. What exactly makes up our civilizational capital? Our stack defines it as the total accumulated sum of our encoded knowledge, our physical infrastructure, our complex financial buffers, and our ecological stability.
It's everything we've built.
It's the surplus energy and resources that allow us to have high-speed internet, advanced medical research, complex art, and hyper-specialized jobs, rather than everyone just subsistence farming to survive.
Right. The surplus is key.
But here's where the structural vulnerability lies. We have optimized our world to such a razor's edge that we've essentially spent all of our civilizational capital just to maintain our current scale.
There's no slack.
None. We operate on a massive, global, just-in-time logistics network. There is virtually no slack in the system. As the pandemic showed us, we don't have massive warehouses of surplus medical supplies or grain reserves just sitting around waiting for a multi-year crisis.
We saw how fast supply chains break down.
Exactly. The ledger operates on the principle that modern civilization has zero tolerance for systemic shocks. A severe event acts as an instantaneous, massive withdrawal from an account that is already overdrawn.
A perfect way to phrase it.
And the sources outline this exhaustion of capital using an absolutely brilliant, albeit chilling, analogy. They compare the structural collapse of our industrial globalized system to the mechanics of biological death.
The three metaphors.
Yes. They outline 3 specific biological metaphors of industrial death, and they are incredibly helpful for visualizing how a complex system dies.
What's the first one?
The first metaphor they use is increased reaction rates, which they directly equate to energy scarcity in a post-shock world. Think about the human body fighting off a severe systemic infection. To survive, the body generates a fever. It ramps up its temperature to kill the pathogen.
Right.
But that fever drastically increases the body's metabolic demand. It needs more calories, more oxygen, more energy, and it needs it faster. In a post-nuclear or post-collapse environment, the sudden desperate demand for heating in a freezing world, coupled with the immense immediate need for reconstruction and medical triage, vastly exceeds the capacity of whatever fragile energy grid remains intact.
It's a profound comparison. The system overheats trying to meet a survival demand it simply doesn't have the fuel for.
Yeah.
You have a decimated energy sector trying to provide 500% more output just to keep people from freezing and to rebuild infrastructure. Just like a feverish body that can't get enough calories will begin to consume its own muscle tissue, a desperate civilization will begin to cannibalize its own long-term infrastructure just to meet the immediate energy needs of tomorrow.
Exactly. It's a system trying to sprint a marathon while actively suffocating.
That's a grim image.
Then we move to the second biological metaphor in the analysis, which is altered protein structure. This directly relates to what the analysts call infrastructure erasure. And this is where the vulnerability of our digital world really comes into focus.
Okay, break that down.
In biology, proteins are the molecular workhorses of the cell, and their ability to function is entirely 100% dependent on their highly specific physical three-dimensional shape. If a protein is subjected to extreme heat or radiation, it unfolds.
Denaturation.
Exactly, a process called denaturation. It loses its highly specific shape, and therefore it immediately ceases to function, even if all the amino acids are still technically there.
The parts are there, but the structure is gone.
Now, apply that to the physical infrastructure of our global network. Let's look at the financial sector or the tech industry. If a single targeted strike or an electromagnetic event destroys a massive semiconductor fabrication plant in Taiwan or the high-frequency financial routing servers in London, you haven't just destroyed steel and concrete.
You've unfolded the protein.
You've essentially unfolded the highly specialized, irreplaceable structures of the global economy. The encoded capital, the proprietary data, the precision manufacturing molds, the synchronized digital ledgers is gone. Once that specific, highly complex shape is erased, the metabolic functions of global trade and digital finance simply stop. You can't just replace a 3-nanometer chip fab with raw silicon and good intentions.
That's a vital point. The loss of that highly ordered structure is often irreversible on any meaningful human timescale. You can't just build it back overnight.
No.
And that leads directly into the third biological metaphor they highlight, membrane fluidity loss, which represents a logistics freeze.
The logistics networks.
Yes. A healthy biological cell relies absolutely on its outer membrane remaining fluid and permeable, allowing life-sustaining nutrients to enter and toxic waste to exit. If that membrane freezes, becomes rigid, or loses its permeability, the cell rapidly dies from its own accumulated waste or from starvation.
Chokes itself out.
Precisely. In our modern context, the logistics networks, the transoceanic shipping lanes, the international rail corridors, the incredibly complex BGP routing protocols that make the global internet function, these are the fluid membrane of the global body.
Right.
In a post-attack environment, you immediately see panic-driven border closures, massive fuel shortages, and what cyber analysts call the splinter net, which is the hard fragmentation of the logical protocols that allow global data to flow.
The physical and digital borders just slam shut.
They do. The system instantly loses the fluidity required to move resources, whether that's grain, medical data, or replacement transformers from where they are abundant to where they are desperately needed. That immediate loss of logistical fluidity is fatal to a civilization that relies on a globally dispersed supply chain.
So if the system is this fragile, How do we accidentally trigger its collapse? Because you look at the devastating math of the terminal ledger, and you have to assume that no rational human being, no world leader, looks at this data and actively chooses to initiate it.
You would hope not.
Right.
But that is the exact unsettling question addressed by a fascinating 2024 forecasting pilot study detailed deeply in our stack of sources.
The FRI study.
Yes, the Forecasting Research Institute, or FRI. They essentially wanted to quantify the risk of accidental or escalating conflict, so they brought together 36 top-tier experts across 3 intensive workshops.
Who were these experts?
One workshop in Washington focused exclusively on U.S.-North Korea risks, one in London mapped out U.S.-Russia scenarios, and one at Stanford focused on the U.S.-China dynamic. We're talking about high-skill quantitative forecasters, veteran nuclear policy experts, cognitive psychologists, and former high-level government officials.
Heavy hitters.
Exactly. Their specific task was to quantitatively predict the actual risk of various crises escalating to nuclear use.
And when you look at the data they produced, the variance in their forecasts is profoundly unsettling. These are the smartest, most informed people in the room looking at the exact same geopolitical data, the same historical precedents, and the same weapon capabilities.
And the same baseline scenarios.
Right. And yet, when they tried to put a hard percentage on the likelihood of a specific crisis escalating to a nuclear exchange, their estimates spanned 7 orders of magnitude.
7.
Think about what that means. You had some experts asserting there was a 2% chance of a conventional crisis escalating, while other experts in the exact same workshop argued the chance was 0.000000001%.
It's a massive gulf.
It wasn't a slight disagreement. It was a fundamental mathematical chasm in how they perceive risk.
And what that massive variance highlights is a terrifying reality about crisis management. There is a profound, fundamental disagreement among the world's foremost experts about how a conflict actually escalates in the real world.
Because there's no real precedent.
Exactly. The study's framework allowed for numerous different escalation pathways. For example, they modeled scenarios where an initial localized conventional skirmish might suddenly bypass intermediate steps and jump straight to a strategic nuclear strike, a pathway they denote as 0 to 5.
Straight to the top.
Or alternatively, a conflict might escalate linearly, step by step, moving from conventional casualties to a heightened nuclear alert status, to a demonstrative regional strike, and finally to a full strategic exchange.
Right.
What that 7 orders of magnitude variance unequivocally proves is the inherent uncontrollability of escalation after first use. The data suggests that no one, not the generals, not the policy wonks, not the forecasters, actually knows how the complex geopolitical system will behave once the initial threshold of conflict is crossed. The friction and fog of war make the predictive models wildly divergent.
And what makes this inherent unpredictability exponentially more volatile is the modern introduction of artificial intelligence into military command and control structures.
The algorithmic element.
Yes. The sources we are analyzing dive deep into this incredibly dangerous concept of algorithmic fragility. We are currently building and deploying these advanced AI systems to process absolutely massive, incomprehensible amounts of sensor data.
Radar, satellites, intercepts.
Exactly. They are increasingly being integrated into early warning systems designed to detect incoming hypersonic missiles or stealth aircraft. And on paper, the logic makes sense. A human can't process 1,000 satellite radar feeds simultaneously, but an AI can do it in milliseconds.
Yes, but these launch-on-warning setups become incredibly destabilizing when tightly coupled with AI decision-making.
How so?
The sheer speed at which an AI processes data and spits out actionable recommendations dramatically shrinks the decision windows for human leaders. In a deep, tense geopolitical crisis, a human leader might only have a matter of minutes to decide whether to launch an irreversible retaliatory strike.
Minutes to decide the fate of the world.
Exactly. If a highly sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar AI system flashes red and tells them a decapitation attack is currently incoming, the psychological and procedural pressure to act immediately without waiting for human verification is immense.
Exactly. And here is where the behavioral science becomes critical. The war games and simulations cited in the research show a 20% to 30% higher chance of rapid escalation when AI is heavily integrated into the decision loop.
That's a massive increase in risk.
It is. And a massive driver of this accelerated escalation is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called automation bias.
Right, the trust in the machine.
Imagine you are the operator sitting in a bunker, staring at these screens during a high-stakes standoff. Automation bias is the inherent human tendency to blindly trust the analytical recommendations of a highly complex machine over your own intuition, or even over conflicting physical evidence.
Especially under stress.
Yes. In a high-stressed, time-compressed, fatigue-ridden environment, if the algorithm definitively states attack imminent, recommend immediate launch to preserve silo integrity, human operators are statistically highly likely to defer to the machine's authority.
They abdicate the decision.
Right. A human analyst might look at the wider context, maybe noticing that the adversary's diplomatic channels are still actively negotiating, or recognizing a subtle nuance in their troop movements that suggests a bluff. The AI, optimizing purely for worst-case mathematical survivability, misses that human nuance entirely.
And that leads to the most dangerous vulnerability of all, the failure to recognize an AI hallucination.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
We have all interacted with commercial generative AI and seen it confidently spit out entirely fictional, weirdly incorrect answers. Now transplant that underlying architectural flaw into an early warning radar AI.
That's terrifying.
Imagine it hallucinating a massive, coordinated missile launch because of an unforeseen sensor glitch, a bizarre weather anomaly, or worse, because of deliberate data poisoning by an adversary's cyber unit.
Just feeding it bad data to make it hallucinate an attack.
Exactly. In the context of the terminal ledger, even a 0.001% error rate in the algorithm is categorically unacceptable when the consequence is the irreversible deployment of civilizational capital.
Right.
This raises an important question that ethicists and engineers are currently wrestling with. Are we slowly surrendering our ultimate survival to black box algorithms that fundamentally cannot comprehend the terminal ledger of civilizational debt?
You just don't get the big picture.
An AI is trained to optimize for a highly specific, mathematically defined outcome, perhaps minimizing immediate military vulnerability or maximizing counterforce destruction. But it completely lacks the holistic, biological understanding of ecological collapse, planetary famine, and the irreversible erasure of infrastructure. It doesn't understand the biological metaphors of a dying civilization. It just ruthlessly executes the math of the strike.
And speaking of executing a strike that unfolds the proteins of our civilization, not all world-ending scenarios require a massive, city-leveling kinetic warhead exploding in the troposphere.
No, they don't.
The source material spends a significant amount of time detailing technological threats that don't rely on blast waves or firestorms. And I want to pause here and explicitly note to you, our listener, that we are examining these geopolitical defense analyses entirely impartially.
Right, purely analytical.
Yes. We are simply reporting the technological assessments regarding Chinese weapons development and U.S. and allied vulnerabilities without taking any political sides. We are purely looking at the physical reality of the technology and its implications for the global grid.
That's a crucial framing, because the technology we need to dissect now is the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, specifically the threat profile surrounding high-altitude EMPs, or HEMPs, as well as localized directed energy weapons.
The invisible threats.
Yes. The sources extensively document a rapidly evolving threat landscape, noting a surge in patents and rapid advancements coming out of various international defense sectors, particularly in pulse generation and advanced microwave source technologies.
We always hear about EMPs in popular media. You know, the hero looks up, there's a flash in the sky, and suddenly every car on the highway stops working and the lights go out. But how does it actually function on a brutal mechanical level? What is physically happening to the infrastructure?
A high-altitude EMP is typically generated by detonating a nuclear device in the vacuum of space miles above the Earth's atmosphere.
So no blast damage on the ground.
Correct. But the massive radiation from the explosion interacts violently with the Earth's upper atmosphere and magnetic field. This interaction, primarily through something called the Compton effect, creates a massive, instantaneous burst of electromagnetic energy.
The pulse.
The pulse. This invisible energy pulse travels down to the surface at the speed of light. When it hits the ground, it induces massive, instantaneous, high voltage and high current surges in anything conductive.
Like power lines.
Yes, it essentially turns long power lines, communication cables, and even the metal framework of buildings into giant, unintended antennas that catch this massive energy wave and funnel it directly into delicate microelectronics that were never designed to handle thousands of volts of phantom current.
And it overloads and physically burns out those delicate pathways.
Instantly.
The source material details the vulnerability of incredibly specific, highly advanced modern technology to illustrate this. For example, They break down the vulnerability of individual exoskeleton booster systems that modern militaries are actively developing for infantry.
The powered armor suits.
Exactly. These suits are engineering marvels, but they rely entirely on highly sensitive components called MEMS microelectromechanical systems. These are microscopic sensors that feed real-time motion and balance data to the suit's control processors.
Tiny little gyros and accelerometer.
Right. An EMP introduces an instantaneous high-voltage impact directly into the delicate cable connections of these MEMS sensors. It causes either immediate transient interference, crashing the software, or completely irreversible physical melting of the microscopic circuits.
Which freezes the suit.
In an instant, the soldier isn't enhanced. They are suddenly trapped inside a dead 80-pound rigid metal suit.
Exactly. The very technology designed to enhance capability becomes a fatal liability when the electronic substrate is compromised. And it's not just large-scale, continent-wide nuclear EMPs that pose this risk.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It does. Here's where the engineering gets deeply localized and covert. The sources detail the rapid development of non-nuclear directed energy weapons. Specifically, they highlight detailed engineering patents for systems like the CETC Portable Microwave Active Denial System, or ADS.
The suitcase weapon. This part of the engineering analysis reads like science fiction, but the schematics and patents are entirely real. They describe an active denial system that is literally packaged into a form factor the size of a standard piece of rolling luggage.
It is the physical, deployable manifestation of what geopolitical strategists and defense engineers are calling Neurostrike capabilities. These aren't weapons designed to blow up concrete. They are highly sophisticated arrays designed to emit intensely focused directional microwave energy
Out of a suitcase.
Right. Because of their size, they can be deployed entirely clandestinely. A single operative could theoretically roll this suitcase right up to the perimeter fence of a major international airfield, a critical military command center, or the data hub of a major financial institution.
And the effects they are engineered to produce are dual purpose, which makes them uniquely terrifying. First, they're designed to target and physically fry highly sensitive electronic equipment within a specific targeted radius, taking out radar arrays, communication routers, or server racks.
The hardware fry.
Right. But secondly, the frequencies can be tuned to target human cognitive functions in central nervous system.
The Neurostrike element.
Because the weapon operates entirely covertly, silently, and without a massive kinetic explosion, the immediate confusion, physiological distress, and operational paralysis it creates among the personnel are profound. You have systems failing and operators incapacitated simultaneously with no obvious point of origin.
It's a completely invisible attack.
Yeah.
If we extrapolate that highly targeted disruption to the macro level and look at the cascading infrastructure failure a wide area EMP or a coordinated directed energy attack could cause, the absolute fragility of our just-in-time society becomes glaringly obvious.
Because it hits everything at once.
Let's look at the specific downstream impacts detailed in the infrastructure analyses. First, consider the power grid's supervisory control and data acquisition systems, the SCADA networks. Advanced grid management relies entirely on millions of delicate network sensors to perfectly balance electrical supply and demand in real time across thousands of miles. An EMP induces currents that physically destroy those sensors and the routers that connect them.
So the grid loses its brain.
Without that data, the automated systems fly blind, leading to instantaneous grid overloads, frequency collapse, and catastrophic physical disruption of massive substations across the network.
And the cascading effects bleed instantly into other sectors. Take aviation logistics. The ground handling networks at international airports, the complex air traffic control radar systems, the ILS landing beacons, they all go completely dark.
While planes are in the air?
You suddenly have thousands of commercial planes in the air that have no ground radar, no digital communication with controllers, and the physical ground infrastructure required to land them safely is paralyzed.
A logistics freeze.
Exactly. And perhaps most significantly in terms of erasing that civilizational capital we keep coming back to is the immediate impact on global financial institutions.
The banks.
Modern finance isn't gold in a vault. It is entirely 100% digital. It relies on high-frequency algorithmic trading networks, synchronized digital ledgers, and massive data centers.
Altered protein structure again?
Yep. A targeted EMP or microwave attack on a financial hub wouldn't just pause trading for the day. It could cause the instantaneous physical erasure of the storage mediums holding the ledgers. If the primary servers are fried and the localized magnetic backups are corrupted by the pulse, the wealth, the ownership records, the entire digital representation of the economy simply ceases to exist.
It's gone.
It's the ultimate execution of the altered protein structure metaphor. The system unfolds, the shape is lost, and the global economy dies.
It's a terrifying vulnerability.
So let's play out the timeline. Let's say the absolute worst happens, whether it's a massive HEMP detonation, a highly coordinated global cyber attack on the SCADA systems, or a biological event that causes personnel to abandon the power plants. The global grid goes down, and due to the sheer scale of the physical destruction to transformers and routing hubs, it stays down.
The long blackout.
We shift now to a deeply fascinating and heavily researched paper from Nanyang Technological University, or NTU, out of Singapore. They ran complex modeling on exactly this scenario. A total industrial power failure lasting not days or weeks, but anywhere between 5 and 25 years.
That specific time frame of 5 to 25 years is crucial to understand.
Why so long?
When a massive electromagnetic event occurs, it doesn't just trip a software breaker that can be reset. It physically melts the copper windings inside extra high voltage transformers. These are massive, incredibly specialized, custom-built pieces of machinery that weigh hundreds of tons.
You can't just pick one up at the hardware store.
No. Even when global society and supply chains are functioning perfectly, they have a manufacturing lead time of 12 to 24 months. So the NTU paper asks a brilliant question that very few disaster planners actually consider. What happens to the vast physical infrastructure of our modern world when it sits entirely unpowered, unmonitored, and unmaintained for a decade?
The answer they provide is a silent, creeping, relentless secondary threat: corrosion, rust, and decay. Without continuous electrical power to run active maintenance systems, dehumidifiers, and cathodic protection circuits, critical industrial sectors literally rot away into the earth. The paper breaks this down sector by sector, and the mechanics of the decay are incredibly eye-opening.
Start with the digital side.
Let's start with information technology. We think of the cloud as ethereal, but it is deeply physical. It relies on massive, power-hungry server farms.
Right.
Without continuous grid power to run the massive HVAC climate control units that keep those server farms cool and critically dry, ambient humidity immediately sets in. The delicate silicon, the microsoldering, the microscopic magnetic platters of our digital infrastructure begin to corrode and oxidize rapidly.
It's melting away in the humidity.
This isn't just about losing access to social media or streaming services. This represents the total, permanent loss of the digital substrate. It's the irreversible erasure of all that encoded civilizational capital. The scientific data, the medical records, the digital libraries of human knowledge, all slowly oxidizing into worthless dust.
It is the silent erasure of history. And then the paper examines the energy and chemical manufacturing sectors.
Like the toxic stuff.
Modern chemical plants and refineries are incredibly complex systems designed to hold, process, and transport highly corrosive, toxic, and volatile substances safely. But they achieve this safety through active maintenance, continuous temperature controls, pressurized seals, and constant electronic monitoring.
All of which require electricity.
Exactly. Without power, those highly corrosive chemicals sit dormant, slowly eating through unmaintained pipes, failing seals, and weakening storage tanks. Over a 5 to 10-year period of neglect, you would see massive, uncontrolled toxic leaks and localized chemical disasters occurring globally simply because the specialized containment pipes rusted through.
And then there is the truly terrifying reality of aging hydroelectric dams. This was one of the most striking and visceral details in the entire NTU analysis. We tend to think of dams as just giant, passive walls of concrete blocking a river.
But they're not passive at all.
No. They are highly dynamic, actively managed structures. They require constant electricity to operate their massive, automated spillway gates. These gates must be continuously adjusted to manage water levels, especially during seasonal flooding or heavy rainfall events.
To let the pressure off.
Right. If the power grid fails permanently, those massive automated gates freeze in place. If a heavy, prolonged rainstorm moves in, the reservoir fills up, the water overtops the concrete structure of the dam, and the dam fails.
It just breaks.
You get catastrophic, sudden downstream flooding, acting like a kinetic weapon, wiping out whatever localized settlements, bridges, or surviving infrastructure happen to make it through the initial event. The NTU paper points out an incredibly sobering protocol. If engineers are facing a long-term, multi-year powered outage, Operators must manually, physically crank and lock the spillways wide open before they abandon the facility.
You have to empty the lake.
You have to let the river run entirely free, surrendering the reservoir, or the dam will eventually break and kill whoever is living downstream.
And this grim reality brings us directly to the core actionable message of the NTU paper and the highly detailed National Research Council source: mitigation and smart resilience.
Solutions, finally.
Yes. How do we engineer our way out of this physical decay? How do we build systems that survive the loss of their creators? The solutions they propose are actually quite practical and grounded in material science, but they require a massive shift in foresight and investment.
Right. Because the goal of this deep dive isn't to leave you feeling helpless. There are highly concrete, engineered steps we can take right now. The researchers enthusiastically detail simple but incredibly effective proactive measures.
Like the chemical tanks.
Yeah, they talk about writing strict protocols for actively removing highly corrosive components or draining specific volatile chemical tanks before operators evacuate a failing facility. They advocate heavily for the widespread, mandated application of advanced next-generation anti-corrosive coatings on all critical exposed infrastructure.
Protective layers.
And they discuss utilizing highly specialized, environmentally sealed protective packaging for vital replacement parts like smaller transformer relays and pump motors, so that when humanity is ready to rebuild 10 years later, the parts haven't rusted into useless blocks of metal.
Exactly. It requires a fundamental paradigm shift from maximizing short-term economic efficiency to maximizing long-term structural resilience. And the National Research Council source expands on this engineering philosophy beautifully with their detailed concept of the smart power delivery system.
Changing the grid itself.
Yes. They argue that we cannot just harden individual components. The architecture of the grid itself needs to be fundamentally redesigned to anticipate its own failure and actively protect itself from cascading collapse.
Yes, they dive deeply into the concept of adaptive islanding. I find the mechanics of this absolutely brilliant.
It's a masterpiece of systems engineering. Adaptive islanding relies on the widespread deployment of INAs, or intelligent network agents. These are highly autonomous, localized hardware and software systems embedded at thousands of nodes throughout the national grid. They don't rely on a central command center. When a massive shock occurs, say, an EMP strikes a regional hub, or a cyber attack takes down a major transmission line, these INAs instantly, within milliseconds, detect the severe voltage fluctuations and frequency drops using localized phase measurement units.
So they see the shockwave coming.
They do. Instead of allowing that massive frequency instability to cascade uncontrollably down the lines and physically destroy transformers across the entire continent, the INAs act entirely autonomously. They instantly trip localized breakers, severing connections to the dying parts of the grid, while isolating and protecting the healthy localized generation assets.
They literally slice the massive vulnerable national grid up into hundreds of small, self-sufficient islands of power.
Hence adaptive islanding.
So instead of one massive, catastrophic continental blackout that takes decades to fix, you have localized, highly protected microgrids. You have a functioning pocket of electricity keeping a municipal water treatment plant running, or a hospital's refrigeration systems online, sustained by local solar, wind, or small modular reactors, while the rest of the macro system is safely offline, waiting to be rebuilt.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this shows that survival in the complex modern age requires much more than just hoarding raw resources or building thicker concrete walls. It requires highly intelligent modular biomimetic design.
Biomimetic like nature.
Right. We have to architect our critical systems to fail gracefully. We have to build global infrastructure that inherently knows how to cleanly amputate a dying limb to save the core body, especially when the human operators are overwhelmed, blinded, or entirely offline.
Wow. We have traversed an incredible, expansive amount of ground today, from the absolute mathematical horror of a few hundred regional nuclear weapons injecting millions of tons of soot into the stratosphere and shutting down the biological engine of the planet.
Down to the cellular level metaphors.
Right. To the profound realization that our highly optimized, just-in-time global logistics networks are essentially rigid cell membranes, perfectly primed to shatter under pressure. We've examined the terrifying reality of how AI algorithms, fueled by human automation bias, could independently trigger a strategic war in a matter of minutes.
The algorithmic fragility.
We've seen how a suitcase-sized microwave weapon deployed outside a server farm could silently erase the digital ledgers that hold the global economy together. And we've looked at the silent, relentless, creeping threat of structural corrosion, eating away at our dams and chemical plants in a theoretical world without power.
It's a heavy ledger to balance.
It is. So I want you
Yeah.
to think about this as you go about your day. Why does this deeply complex systemic data matter to you? You still have to drive to work. You still have to go to the grocery store today. You still have to pay your bills. The daily routine continues. It matters because recognizing this profound fragility is the absolute first necessary step towards systemic change. It's about looking at the incredible, intricate, and deeply fragile web of systems that pump water to your faucet, deliver food to your local shelves, power your home's heating, and secure your life savings, and realizing that pure, unbridled efficiency isn't enough anymore.
We need buffers.
We have to demand better, smarter resilience from our institutions and our engineers. We have to actively ask our local and national leaders how they are physically hardening the grid, how they are legislating the risks of AI integration and defense, and whether they truly deeply understand the immense kinetic debt of the systems they manage on our behalf.
It all comes back to how we value and protect that civilizational capital. We have spent the last century building vast, hyper-connected digital networks and endlessly complex global supply chains. But in doing so, we have inadvertently created a planetary-scale single point of failure, a massive existential kinetic debt just waiting for a catalyst to be called in.
The debt that must be paid.
And exploring this leaves us with a final, lingering, and perhaps provocative thought. As we look to the future, perhaps the ultimate technological advancement for the human species isn't building a faster algorithmic trading bot, or a more destructive hypersonic weapon, or even a more expansive, globally interconnected smart grid.
What is it then?
Perhaps the true pinnacle of a highly advanced, resilient civilization is having the wisdom to intentionally relearn and integrate the analog, hyper-local skills of community trust, localized agriculture, and decentralized production. If we can intelligently architect a world where the sudden loss of a microchip fabrication plant or a constellation of routing satellites doesn't mean the literal end of human history, then we will have truly, finally secured our civilizational capital.
That is an incredibly powerful, clarifying thought to leave on. A truly resilient world is one that bends but doesn't completely shatter when a single invisible wire is cut.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intense, expansive, but absolutely vital exploration of our world's hidden architecture and its profound fragilities. Keep asking the hard questions, demand smart resilience in the vital systems you rely on every single day, and above all, stay relentlessly curious. We will see you on the next deep dive.